Hi, everyone. I'm Rivera Sun. I'm an author and an activist and a trainer in strategy for nonviolent change. And what this means is that I get to work with people like yourselves all over the US and sometimes internationally who are looking for all the ways that they can make change on the issues that we care so deeply about for peace, for social justice, for having a livable climate and a livable future, for societies and cultures that are fair and just and welcoming to our friends and our neighbors and our fellow classmates if we're still in school, or our fellow workers if we are older than that. And I get the great joy of seeing that the movements are powerful, that they are making changes. I know it can feel really overwhelming and that there's this onslaught of bad news coming out of the news every single day. But what's less reported on and less seen is how people are standing up and pushing back and really using creativity to do so. When we look at nonviolent action, one of the things that characterizes it is that, first of all, it's not passivity. So it's not doing nothing, right? Nonviolence isn't just standing back and letting problems happen. It's also not violence. So we're not throwing punches at people. We're not threatening them with violence. But what it is everything else in between. And it's everything, every other creative strategy that we can use. And that means that we have a lot of tools in our toolbox, over 300 different methods that have been counted and cataloged, let alone the ones that we're inventing every single day, with which we can stand up to injustice. Some of these are things that I'm sure you have experience with, right? Protests, marches, signs, and posters, wearing stickers or wearing pins, symbolic items, even doing things like walkouts from class or going to a march or a rally or a demonstration. Lots of young people and lots of people of all ages have a lot of experience with this. These are common. Some things are things that we have a little less experience with, but maybe our friends, our relatives, our neighborhoods have experience with. So strikes and boycotts, walkouts, shutdowns, sit-ins. And then there's things that are a little bit riskier, things that are like direct confrontation, but non-violently. And we're seeing this a lot in our streets today, right? People standing up to agents, ICE agents, federal agents, and saying, no, you need to go away. Or people doing civil disobedience to unjust laws and saying, I won't carry this out. I won't do what's wrong. In fact, did you know that not only 9% of our military troops say they will obey any order whatsoever? 89% of them say, oh, sorry, 91% of them say that they will not obey unjust, immoral, or unconstitutional orders, all of which is a form of civil disobedience to or noncompliance with a direct order because they have a conscience, because they know that some things are wrong and they have to stand up. So all of these things we've just mentioned, they're, just the tip of the iceberg of the toolbox. And the thing about nonviolent action is it's incredibly creative, like mind-blowingly creative. And it includes things from people around the world, things like Cambodian monks ordaining trees as other Buddhist monks, because that means that the loggers wouldn't cut them down because it was a spiritual taboo. How creative is that? We also know about the Italian sculptors who would make these concrete sculptures and then drop them into the ocean so that when the trawling nets would come to try to trawl their way through the seabed, they would get caught on these sculptures and they would rip. And it didn't take very much of this, very long for this to be going on, for seabed trawling to completely stop in the area. Right? Nobody picked up a gun, nobody waged a war, but they found a creative way to say, you can't keep destroying this environment. We have examples of things like a Canadian artist who copyrighted his land. Now, he did land-based art, kind of like Andy Goldsworthy, but he would make giant sculptures in the woods of his land. And he found out that a pipeline was planned to be built right through his land. And instead of putting up a blockade like you might have seen, or instead of trying to fight legal battles just to get an injunction against the pipeline, he did something very clever. He said, I'm going to copyright all of my land, and then the pipeline company has to fight a legal case over whether they can violate my copyright or not. And you know what? They lost. He won. He also charged them like $500 an hour for any consultation, which I thought was very, very clever. So, when we look around, people are resisting injustice with all of their creativity, and artists are particularly great at this. We're in the practice of defying cultural expectations, expanding people's minds with sculpture, with art, with music, with creativity. And when we join forces with social justice, we're really unstoppable. In Hungary, you might have heard about this. In Hungary, the president banned LGBTQ marches and the rainbow symbol, right? Much as we're seeing people try to do, like in Salt Lake City, for example. But in Hungary, what people decided to do was that they all put on gray clothing and they got gray banners and gray flags, and they held a protest march all in gray. Imagine that for a minute. So suddenly it looked like all the color was stripped out of the world. And they said, this is what life is going to be like under this authoritarian president who hates our LGBTQ brothers and sisters. Is this grayness worth it? Is this the world we want to live in? And the answer was no. And so, what a creative way to challenge that law. I think, when we get creative about what we're doing, we find ways that are unexpected, that are joyful, that can celebrate what we feel is worth lifting up, that can defy with our full humanity intact. In San Francisco, when the authorities tried to ban food sharing, a group of community members set up a 90-table banquet to share food with community members and unhoused persons in direct defiance of the law, so civil disobedience. And because it was so over the top, there were tablecloths, there were goblets, there was, bouquets of flowers, there was 6 or 7 courses to this meal. Because it was so over the top, it really called the bluff on the cruelty of this law. And it meant that if the city had tried to crack down on it, they would have looked so foolish. And indeed, it almost immediately overturned that law. So, one of the things I love about creativity in action is it sometimes allows us to go bigger, to go bolder, to break out of just what they expect, right? They expect us to just march around and be angry. What they can't really deal with is all our other emotions, our joy, our humor, sometimes even our sorrow. In the UK, they held a hundreds of persons large funeral for nature. Because you may have heard, UK is experiencing one of the fastest biodiversity losses on the planet. So they're losing their species. So people, instead of just saying, we're so angry at the politicians, which the politicians know already, they express their sorrow. We are in such grief that our society is doing this. And they were dared to be vulnerable in public. And, it really captured media attention. It got people talking about what it means to live in a place where you no longer hear birdsong. You no longer see the butterflies or the insects that your parents grew up seeing. And it was a very powerful way. Now, one more story and then I'll close. In El Paso, you guys are dealing with ICE crackdowns, immigration raids, and a new detention center being planned, built, and expanded. A few years ago, the No Kids in Cages um, campaign erupted and brought to public consciousness the problem of family separation, migrant family separation, and the imprisonment of children in these facilities. What brought it to public attention was not a street demonstration. It was an act of street sculpture where they put a chain link fence cage and a sculpture of a child sleeping under a mylar blanket into the sculpture. And then they had a little QR code to say, find out what No Kids in Cages is all about. These went up in a couple cities around the US, and within 1 week, it cracked through public consciousness. And people realized what a horror was happening out of sight, out of mind. And it brought the issue straight into the heart of the people. So when you look at making change in our world, remember that you have more power than you think, and that your most creative, wild ideas have places in this movement, that we need them. We need your joy, your sorrow, your creativity, your humor, your laughter. And to remember that as you move into action, there are millions of people moving into action with you, that you're not alone, and that there are many of us rooting for the same vision of a world of peace, a world of justice, and a world where everyone belongs. So thank you for allowing me to be part of your wonderful symposium today. I hope my path crosses with yours sometime in the future.